Good evening, friends. Before the fire dies and the darkness presses against the windows, I need to confess something that has been eating at me since I first began collecting these stories. Piecing together fragments from old police reports, frantic voicemails, grainy trail cam footage, and handwritten letters from people who swear they'll never set foot in the woods again. There is a question that keeps me awake, the same one that likely haunted our ancestors around flickering campfires centuries ago. What if the monsters we dismissed as myths, the ones we turned into cautionary tales to scare children into obedience, were never myths at all? What if they were desperate warnings, carved into birch bark by trembling hands, whispered across generations by elders who had seen too much, screamed into the void by those who barely escaped with their lives? Tonight, we are going to follow that scream to its source, to an entity that has terrorized the indigenous peoples of North America for thousands of years. Something so horrifying that even speaking its name was once believed to summon its attention, something that modern society has tried to bury under layers of skepticism and rationalization. We are talking about Wendigo. I know what some of you are thinking right now. Another cryptid story. Another Bigfoot knockoff with a different name and a colder climate. But here is what separates the Wendigo from every other creature of legend, and why it should genuinely keep you up at night. Unlike Sasquatch or the Mothman, which remains safely confined to remote wilderness areas or blurry photographs, Wendigo sightings are increasing exponentially, and they are no longer limited to the deep northern forests where they were supposed to dwell. They are happening closer, much closer, in state parks, along highways, in the wooded lots behind suburban developments, sometimes mere yards from backyard barbecues and children's swing sets. So tonight, I want you to sit with a question, really let it settle into your bones. If thousands of people across centuries, cultures, and continents describe the same impossibly tall, emaciated figure with glowing eyes and an insatiable hunger, experience the same bone-chilling dread, and report the same supernatural abilities, voice mimicry, impossible speed, shape-shifting, at what point do we stop calling it folklore and start calling it fact? Let us find out together, but first, lock your doors, draw the curtains, and whatever you do, do not answer if something outside calls your name in a voice you recognize. The ancient terror begins in the subarctic forests where the United States bleeds into Canada, where the trees grow so dense that sunlight struggles to touch the frozen ground, where winter can strip the flesh from your bones in hours if you are unprepared, and where something has always been waiting, something that predates every modern settlement, every colonial flag planted, every government land claim. The Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Innu, knew it was there long before Europeans arrived with their maps and muskets. It is woven into their oral histories like a scar that refuses to heal, a presence so malevolent that elders still refuse to say its name aloud, believing that to speak it is to invite its gaze. They call it the Wendigo, but understand this. It is not just another monster, not an oversized bear or a misidentified moose in the twilight. The Wendigo is corruption given physical form, the embodiment of humanity's darkest impulses, cannibalism, greed, the kind of hunger that can never be satisfied no matter how much you consume. The legends are consistent across tribes and regions. Wendigos were once human, ordinary men and women who, driven by starvation during brutal winters, or by desperation, or sometimes by pure malice, committed the ultimate taboo and consumed human flesh. In that act, their humanity was stripped away, replaced by an eternal, agonizing hunger that grows with every victim. The more they eat, the taller they become, the hungrier they grow, trapped in a cycle that can never be broken. Physically, they are described with chilling uniformity, 8 to 15 feet tall, bodies emaciated to the point of skeletal, skin pulled so tight over protruding bones that every ridge and hollow is visible, the skin itself a sickly gray-white or bluish tint like a corpse left in snow for weeks. But it is the eyes that survivors remember most vividly, glowing with an unnatural light, sometimes electric blue, sometimes pure white, and always completely devoid of anything resembling humanity. When a Wendigo looks at you, it does not see a person, it sees meat, it sees prey, it sees the next meal in an endless feast. And then there are the abilities that defy every law of nature. It can mimic any human voice with perfect accuracy, calling out in the exact tone of your child, your spouse, your best friend, to lure you away from safety. It can move through the densest forest with impossible speed and absolute silence despite its size. Some accounts claim it can plant suggestions in your mind, create confusion, make you lose your way in woods you have navigated your entire life. For generations, European settlers and colonizers dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, tales told to frighten children into staying close to the fire. But then something began to happen that forced even the most rational minds to reconsider. Throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, white trappers, loggers, and hunters, men who prided themselves on their knowledge of the wilderness and their rejection of native myths, began reporting encounters that matched the indigenous legends with eerie precision. Documented cases of Wendigo psychosis emerged in remote communities, where individuals became convinced they were transforming, feeling the hunger growing inside them like a living thing, and in several recorded instances, these people became violent and had to be killed by their own families or neighbors before they could harm others. Modern psychologists label it a culture-bound syndrome, a form of mass hysteria or severe mental illness triggered by starvation and isolation, but the survivors of these cases and the communities that executed them believed they were stopping a transformation that had already begun. The reports never ceased. They continued through the decades, and as America expanded westward and northward, as more people pushed into previously uninhabited territories, the encounters multiplied. Today, in our era of smartphones, social media, and constant connectivity, something remarkable and terrifying is happening. The reports are not only continuing, they are accelerating, and they are coming from places that should be safe, places far removed from the remote northern forests where Wendigos were supposed to be confined. People are encountering these creatures in state parks, near suburban neighborhoods, along highways, in the woods behind residential developments, and the question that haunts researchers, investigators, and anyone who studies these cases is simple but chilling. Are Wendigos expanding their territory because human development is encroaching on their habitat, or were they always here, lurking at the edges of our awareness, and we are only now paying attention because we have finally pushed far enough into their domain? What I am about to share with you are 3 accounts from the last 15 years, 3 separate encounters in 3 different locations involving people who had no connection to each other and no knowledge of each other's experiences. These are not ancient legends passed down through generations. These are modern reports from credible witnesses, a former United States Marine, a 15-year veteran police officer, and an ordinary businessman visiting his family, and their stories share disturbing similarities that raise an uncomfortable question we will explore throughout this investigation. If the Wendigo is real, if it truly exists, then how many of the missing persons cases that plague rural America each year are actually unsolved murders committed by something that should only exist in nightmares? Let us begin with the first account, The Voice in the Woods. The summer of 2019 was particularly brutal in the American South, with temperatures soaring into the triple digits and humidity thick enough to choke on. And it was during this oppressive heat that Bradley Clark, a former Marine who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, found himself between jobs and with time to kill. He had recently returned stateside after years of service, and like many veterans, he was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. His military training had prepared him for combat, for operating under extreme stress, for surviving in hostile environments. But it had not prepared him for the mundane challenges of job hunting, filling out endless online forms, and trying to explain gap years filled with classified deployments to skeptical HR representatives. He felt unmoored, disconnected from the world he had fought to protect, so when an old friend from his unit, a man named Jacob, reached out and invited him to spend a long weekend at his new place in northern Alabama, Bradley jumped at the opportunity without hesitation. Jacob had left the service a year earlier and bought property in a small, remote community near the Tennessee border, several acres of land with a modest single-story house, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It was the kind of place where your nearest neighbor might be a mile away through thick pine, where you could fire off rounds in your backyard without anyone calling the cops, where the night sky was so clear of light pollution that the Milky Way looked like a river of diamonds spilled across black velvet. For Jacob, it was paradise. a place to decompress and find peace after years of war, and for Bradley, it sounded like exactly what he needed, a few days away from the stress of job applications and uncertain futures. A chance to reconnect with an old friend and maybe do some hunting like they used to talk about during those long, boring watches in the desert. The first day of Bradley's visit was everything they had hoped for. They caught up on old times, shared war stories that grew taller with each beer, grilled thick ribeye steaks on Jacob's back porch while the sun set over the tree line in a blaze of orange and purple. And for the first time in months, Bradley felt normal, like maybe civilian life could work out after all. The next morning, they decided to go hunting, nothing too ambitious, just a few hours in the woods to see if they could bag a deer or some wild turkey. Jacob knew the area well by now, or at least he thought he did, having spent months exploring the forest around his property, familiarizing himself with the terrain, the game trails, the best spots to set up a blind. "We'll stay close to the house," Jacob assured Bradley as they geared up with hunting rifles, basic supplies, and camouflage jackets. "No point in going deep, there's plenty of deer movement right in this area." They set out mid-morning, the weather perfect for early summer. Not too hot yet, clear skies, just enough of a breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay, and for several hours, they moved through the woods with practiced silence, their military training evident in how they communicated with hand signals, maintained situational awareness, and kept their rifles at the ready but not raised. But they did not see much, a few squirrels, some birds, nothing worth taking a shot at, and as the afternoon wore on and the temperature began to climb, they decided to call it a day. It had been a nice walk at least, a good way to clear their heads and stretch their legs after months of sedentary job searching. They were following a familiar trail back toward where Jacob had parked his truck, maybe half a mile away, an easy 10-minute walk through pine and oak, when Bradley noticed Jacob suddenly tense up ahead of him. His friend had stopped walking and was standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening to something carried on the wind. "You hear that?" Jacob whispered without turning around, and Bradley stopped and listened. At first, he heard nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the forest, wind rustling leaves, birds calling in the distance, insects droning, but then he heard it too, something moving through the woods off to their right, not moving carefully either, but crashing through the underbrush with urgency, breaking branches, making no attempt at stealth whatsoever. Instinctively, both men raised their rifles, training them in the direction of the sound, Bradley's heart rate increasing but his hands remaining steady. This was not his first time in a potentially dangerous situation, and the military had trained that nervousness out of him years ago. "Could be a bear," Bradley whispered, "or maybe a wounded deer thrashing around," but Jacob did not respond, though Bradley could see his jaw clench tight, and something about his friend's body language was wrong. This was not just caution, this was fear, raw and unmistakable. The crashing sounds grew louder, closer, and then, suddenly, they saw movement through the trees, maybe 50 yards away. Something running fast, multiple somethings actually. And a pack of coyotes burst out of the tree line and onto the trail about 30 yards in front of them, 5 or 6 of them Bradley estimated, moving at full sprint in a blind panic, and here's what struck him as immediately wrong. Coyotes are typically cautious around humans. Even in a pack, they will usually give people a wide berth, especially people who are obviously armed and standing their ground, but these coyotes did not even look at them. They just kept running, crossing the trail and disappearing into the woods on the other side as if Bradley and Jacob were not even there, as if they were running from something so terrifying that 2 armed humans did not even register as a threat. "That's not normal," Bradley said quietly, and Jacob agreed with a tight no. "It's not." And they stood there for a long moment, waiting, listening, the forest having gone eerily quiet, even the birds having stopped singing, and in all his time in combat zones, Bradley had learned that silence was often the most dangerous sound. It meant predators were near. Then they heard it, a heavy, deliberate impact like something massive striking the ground, followed by a creaking, groaning sound, the sound of wood under extreme stress, and then, with a thunderous crash that made both men flinch, a full-sized pine tree toppled across the trail ahead of them, the trunk slamming into the earth with enough force to shake the ground beneath their boots. For several seconds, neither man moved. They just stared at the fallen tree, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Pine trees do not just fall over on calm, clear days. There was barely any wind. The tree had looked healthy from what Bradley could see. There was no reason for it to fall. No rot, no lightning strike, nothing. "Did that just—" Bradley started to say, but Jacob cut him off with a sharp "yeah." "Yeah." It did, and they were about to approach the fallen tree, to investigate what might have caused it to fall with such violent force, when they heard something else. Something that made Bradley's blood turn to ice in his veins despite the warm summer air. A voice, a girl's voice, young, teenage maybe, and she was calling for help. "Jacob, please help me. I'm stuck." Bradley saw his friend's face go white, actually white, like all the blood had drained out of it in an instant, and Jacob whispered, "That's Olivia. That's my little sister." But the voice came again, more desperate. "Jacob, please. I need help. I can't move it." And the voice seemed to be coming from behind the fallen tree, and it genuinely sounded like a young girl in distress. The kind of sound that would make any decent person rush to help without a second thought. But Jacob had grabbed Bradley's arm, gripping it hard enough to bruise, and he hissed, Don't move." And when Bradley started to protest, "But if your sister," Jacob cut him off with a shaking voice. "That's not my sister. Olivia's at home. She's at home right now, probably watching TV or on her phone. She doesn't know where we are. She doesn't even have a car. There's no way she could be out here." The voice called out again, and this time there was something different about it. Something slightly off that Bradley couldn't quite identify at first. The words were right, the tone was right, but there was something underneath it. Something wrong at a fundamental level, a subtle electronic glitch in the cadence, a hollow echo that no human throat should produce, and it pleaded, "Jacob, why won't you help me? I'm scared, please, Jacob." And Bradley felt his hand tighten on his rifle, every instinct screaming that they were in danger. This wasn't right. None of this was right. They stood frozen, neither man sure what to do, the voice continuing to call for several more seconds, pleading, begging for help in Olivia's exact voice, and then, abruptly, it stopped. Just cut off mid-sentence as if someone had pulled the plug on a recording, and the silence that followed was absolute. Bradley could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could hear Jacob's rapid, shallow breathing beside him, could hear nothing else at all. No insects, no birds, no wind, just the weight of something watching. And then something stood up behind the fallen tree. At first, Bradley's mind tried to rationalize it, to make it into something normal, a person standing up maybe, someone who had been crouched down and was now rising to full height. But as this thing continued to rise and rise and rise, Bradley's rational mind gave up trying to explain it. This was no person. This was no animal. This was something else entirely. The creature that loomed over the fallen pine tree stood at least 9 feet tall, maybe more, its body grotesquely thin, skeletal, emaciated like something that had been starved for months or years, its skin pale, deathly pale, stretched so tight over its bones that Bradley could see every ridge of its ribcage, every knob of its spine, every joint protruding like coat hooks, but it was the eyes that Bradley would see in his nightmares for years afterward. They glowed. Actually glowed with an eerie blue light that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside the creature's skull. There were no pupils, no irises, just that unnatural blue light pouring out like twin searchlights. And those eyes were locked onto Bradley and Jacob with an intensity that was almost physical, like the creature's gaze had weight behind it, like it was pressing them into the earth. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Nobody moved. The creature stared at them. They stared back. Time seemed to have stopped, the forest holding its breath, and then Bradley's training kicked in. He started to raise his rifle, to bring it to bear on this thing that should not exist. But Jacob's hand shot out and grabbed the barrel, forcing it down with surprising strength, and he said urgently, "No, we run. Run now." And then they were running, crashing through the forest with abandon. All pretense of stealth forgotten. Branches whipping their faces, roots trying to trip them, and behind them Bradley could hear sounds, branches breaking, something large moving through the trees with impossible speed. But he didn't dare look back. Jacob was ahead of him, and Bradley just focused on keeping up, on not tripping over rocks or roots, on getting to the truck, the forest seeming to go on forever, what should have been a 10-minute walk turning into an eternity of running. Gasping for air, muscles burning, lungs on fire, Bradley's military fitness the only thing keeping him going. He couldn't imagine how a civilian would have managed this. And finally, blessedly, they broke out of the tree line and into the clearing where Jacob had parked. They didn't slow down until they were both in the truck, doors locked, engine roaring to life, Jacob throwing the vehicle into drive and flooring it, sending gravel spraying as they fishtailed onto the dirt road. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and those woods did either of them speak, and Bradley finally managed to gasp out between breaths, "What the hell was that?" And Jacob's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, his face still pale as death, and he said quietly, "I don't know for sure, but I've heard stories since I moved here, from local hunters, from some of the old-timers in town, things that live in the deep woods, things that can mimic voices, that can lure people away from safety." And Bradley, even though he had just seen it with his own eyes, said that's not possible. Things like that don't exist. But Jacob replied, "I know what we heard. That thing spoke with Olivia's voice. Man, her exact voice. How does anything explain that?" And Bradley didn't have an answer. When they got back to Jacob's house, the first thing Jacob did was call his sister, and Bradley watched as his friend's relief was palpable when Olivia answered. And Jacob asked, "Where are you?" And Bradley could hear her confused voice through the phone. "I'm at home." "Where else would I be? Why are you being weird?" And Jacob asked, "What have you been doing today?" And she said, homework? And I watched some Netflix." "Jacob, seriously? What's going on?" And Jacob closed his eyes and said nothing. "Just checking in, I'll see you later, okay?" And after he hung up, the two men looked at each other. There was no reasonable explanation for what had happened. No rational way to explain a 9-foot-tall creature with glowing eyes that could perfectly mimic a teenage girl's voice. They never went back into those woods, and they never spoke about what they had seen, not to anyone else. But Bradley Clark would never forget. He had seen combat, had been in genuinely life-threatening situations, had faced enemy fighters and IEDs and all the terrors that modern warfare could throw at him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever terrified him the way that thing in the woods had. Because when you are in combat, you are facing another human being, you understand the threat, you can fight back, you can take cover, you can use tactics and training. But that thing was not human. That was not something you could fight or reason with. That was something ancient and hungry and wrong. And the worst part was that Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that when he had raised his rifle, when he had started to aim at the creature, there had been a moment, just a split second, where the thing had smiled at him, like it knew bullets wouldn't work, like it knew exactly what he was thinking, like it had all the time in the world. 3 years before Bradley Clark's terrifying encounter in Alabama, and over 1,000 miles to the southwest, a Houston-based police officer named Adam Reed was about to have an experience that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and the monsters that might share it with us. Adam was a 15-year veteran of the Houston Police Department. He had worked patrol, he had worked special operations. He had seen pretty much everything a major American city could throw at a cop. Gang violence, domestic disputes that ended in blood, drug operations that left bodies in bathtubs, horrific accidents on rain-slicked highways. None of it fazed him anymore. You develop a thick skin in that line of work. You have to, or it breaks you. But Adam had a secret that most of his colleagues didn't know. He absolutely loved the country. Despite working in one of the largest cities in America, Adam lived on a small farm about 45 minutes outside Houston in a rural community where he could decompress after his shifts. Wide open spaces, fresh air, a few cows, some chickens, the whole pastoral package that felt like a different planet from the concrete jungle he policed. His closest neighbor was a man named Luke, who lived on the adjacent property, and Luke and Adam had become good friends over the years. They often carpooled into the city together when their schedules aligned, taking turns driving to save on gas and vehicle wear. And on this particular autumn evening in 2015, Adam had agreed to give Luke a ride home after they had both finished night shifts. Luke had gone out with some work friends for a few drinks and didn't want to drive home impaired, so he had called Adam to pick him up from the bar district. And it was a routine favor between friends, nothing unusual, just a short drive back to their rural neighborhood. Maybe half an hour on the highway and then another 15 minutes on the back roads that led to their properties. The night was clear and cool, perfect Texas autumn weather with a hint of wood smoke in the air, and Adam and Luke chatted casually about their respective nights at work, made plans to maybe do some hunting that weekend, complained about the usual things: bills, taxes, the perpetual projects that came with owning property. And when Adam turned off the highway onto the series of dirt roads that led to their homes, he didn't notice anything unusual at first. These roads were pitch black at night, no streetlights, no nearby houses, just the narrow cone of his headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. But as they approached Luke's property, as Adam's headlights swept across the driveway in the front yard, both men saw something that made Adam ease off the gas pedal and let the truck roll to a slow stop. There were lights, 2 bright lights positioned near Luke's fire pit, which sat about 40 yards from the house. Luke had dug that pit himself a few months earlier, a deep excavation maybe 5 or 6 feet deep and 10 feet across. Ringed with field stones he had gathered from his land, it was a good pit, deep enough to contain a serious bonfire without risk of spreading, and from inside that pit, 2 lights were shining up at them, bright, really bright, like high-powered flashlights or maybe even spotlights, but they were positioned low, down in the pit, angled up toward the sky in a way that was just odd, unnatural, wrong. "Did you leave something running out there?" Adam asked, stopping the car about 40 yards away. "Flashlights or something?" And Luke squinted at the lights and said, "No man, I haven't even used the pit in a couple weeks. There shouldn't be anything out there." And they sat in the car staring at these lights, trying to make sense of them, and then, as both men watched, the lights blinked out, complete darkness for maybe 2 seconds, and then they came back on. And Adam started to say, "Did those just?" But Luke finished slowly. "Yeah, they blinked, like eyes," and a cold feeling was starting to creep up Adam's spine, because in his years as a cop he had developed good instincts for when something was wrong, and every one of those instincts was starting to fire now, screaming at him that this was not teenagers with flashlights, this was not a prank, this was something else. "We've got trespassers," Adam said, his voice dropping into his professional cop tone, calm but edged with steel. "Stay here. I'm gonna check it out." And he reached for the service pistol he always carried even off duty. Even in civilian clothes, force of habit and one that had saved his life more than once, but as he opened the car door, Luke put a hand on his arm and said, "I'm coming with you. This is my property, and I'm getting my rifle." And Adam nodded, "All right, but stay behind me and don't fire unless I do. Understand?" And Luke ran to his house while Adam approached the fire pit cautiously, using the headlights from his car to illuminate the area, his pistol drawn and held in a proper 2-handed grip, safety off, eyes scanning constantly for movement, for threats, for anything that didn't belong. And as he reached the edge of the pit and looked down into it, he found nothing. The pit was empty, just charred wood from the last fire, some ashes. Nothing that could have produced those lights. And that is when he heard the footsteps behind him, soft but deliberate, and Adam's training took over instantly. He spun, ready to engage a threat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty yard illuminated by his headlights and the stars above, and then he heard Luke shouting from the porch, "Adam, behind you." And Adam turned again, and this time he saw it, saw him, saw it. A figure was running. No, not running. Loping away from him, heading for the tree line about 50 yards away. And this figure was wrong in ways that Adam's brain struggled to process, even as he watched it. First, it was too tall, way too tall. Adam estimated it at 8 feet minimum. Maybe closer to 9, its proportions were all wrong too. Arms and legs that seemed too long, too thin, like jointed pipe clears, and it moved with a strange, jerky gait that didn't look like any animal Adam had ever seen. Even in the dim light, Adam could see that the thing's skin was pale, not just pale, almost white, like chalk or bone or something that had never seen sunlight, and a sharp crack split the night as Luke fired his rifle from the porch. The creature didn't even slow down, and Adam raised his own weapon and fired 3 times in rapid succession, aiming for center mass like he had been trained. He was a good shot, qualified expert every year, never missed his pistol recertification. At this range, he should have been able to hit a man-sized target easily, but the creature reached the tree line and disappeared into the darkness without a stagger, without a sound, without any indication it had been hit. "Did I hit it?" Luke shouted, running over with his rifle, and Adam admitted, "I don't know. I should have. I know I should have." But I didn't see it react at all, and they stood there for a moment, both men's hearts pounding, adrenaline surging through their systems like electricity, and then Luke made a decision: we're going after it. If there's something dangerous on my property, I need to know what it is, and Adam wanted to argue. Wanted to say this was a job for animal control or fish and wildlife or somebody else. But he was a cop. He had signed up to protect people, to confront danger when necessary, and his friend needed help, so he said, "All right, but we stick together and we're careful. We treat this like clearing a building, slow and controlled," and they grabbed flashlights from Luke's house and headed into the woods. For 20 minutes they searched the area where the creature had disappeared. They found disturbed undergrowth, broken branches, signs that something large had moved through recently, but no blood, no body. Nothing that suggested Adam or Luke had actually hit their target, and then they heard it, a rustling sound from above them. Both men pointed their flashlights up into the trees, and there, perched on a branch at least 15 feet off the ground, were those eyes again, those glowing eyes staring down at them with that same eerie light they had seen in the fire pit. And as their lights illuminated the creature more fully, Adam got his first good look at it, and he wished to God he hadn't. It was crouched on the branch like some massive, twisted gargoyle, its body skeletal, emaciated, covered in that pale white skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its face, its face, it was elongated, almost like a snout, but still disturbingly human in some ways, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and those eyes, those glowing horrible eyes that seemed to look right through him, right into him. And the creature's mouth opened and a sound came out that Adam would never be able to adequately describe. It was like a roar, but mixed with screaming. Mixed with sounds no animal should be able to make. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from everywhere at once, and both men opened fire. The creature leaped from the branch, a jump that should have been impossible from that height, and disappeared back into the darkness. They heard it moving, crashing through the underbrush. But it was moving fast, faster than any human could run, faster than seemed possible for something that size. For another 10 minutes, they pursued it. They fired at sounds, at movements in the shadows. Adam went through an entire magazine and reloaded. Luke fired so many times his rifle was running hot, and then just like that it was gone. The sounds stopped, the forest went quiet. They searched for another half hour but found nothing except trampled undergrowth, and those strange triangular impressions pressed into the soft earth, like tracks but not from any animal Adam recognized. And as dawn began to break and they finally gave up the search, Adam and Luke returned to Luke's house exhausted, confused, and deeply shaken. And Luke asked echoing Bradley Clark's question from thousands of miles away, "And 3 years in the future, what the hell was that?" And Adam didn't have an answer. He was a rational man. He believed in evidence, in science, in things that could be explained. But he had just spent hours chasing something that defied explanation, something that couldn't possibly exist, and the next morning they went back into the woods to search in daylight. They found the areas where the creature had moved through, found more of those strange triangular tracks, found places where branches had been broken at heights that no human could reach, but they never found blood, never found any evidence that their bullets had actually hit anything. And Adam never filed an official report. Who would he report it to? What would he say? "I encountered a 9-foot-tall pale creature with glowing eyes on my friend's property." They would think he had been drinking, or worse, he could lose his job, his reputation, everything he had worked for, but he knew what he had seen. And so did Luke. They had seen something that shouldn't exist, something that could climb trees like a cat despite being the size of a large man, something that could stare down 2 armed men without fear, something that bullets didn't seem to affect. And whatever it was living in the woods of rural Texas, not in Canada, not in Minnesota or Michigan or any of the remote northern forests where monsters were supposed to live. Right here, in the woods behind Luke's house, maybe in the woods behind Adam's house too, and that realization terrified Adam more than any armed criminal he had ever faced, because criminals you could understand, you could predict their behavior. You could use tactics and training to gain an advantage, but this thing was something else entirely, something that operated by different rules, something that maybe didn't even care about humans except as potential prey. And Adam started carrying a rifle in his truck after that night, not his service pistol, a rifle with rounds that could drop a bear, and he still does to this day, and he never ever goes into the woods alone after dark anymore. Our final account takes us north, back to the creature's traditional territory, back to Canada, where the Wendigo legends originated, where the deep forests stretch for hundreds of miles unbroken, where winter can kill the unprepared in hours, and where ancient things might still lurk far from human civilization. But even here, closer to the source, the encounters have become more brazen, more personal, more terrifying. Late in the winter of 2010, a businessman named Robert Garvey decided to visit his family in rural Canada. Robert had moved to the United States years earlier for his career. Working in finance in New York City, he had grown up in the Canadian wilderness, but had left it behind, trading forests and rivers for skyscrapers and subways, trading snow and ice for concrete and steel, but family is family. And when his father called and invited him to come home for a visit, Robert agreed. It had been too long, he realized. He had become disconnected from his roots, from his family, from the land that had shaped his childhood, and his father and older brother James were excited to take him hunting just like old times. Never mind that Robert hadn't been hunting in over a decade, that he barely remembered how to handle a rifle properly, that he had gone soft living in the city with its gyms and delivery apps and climate-controlled apartments. James lent him the appropriate gear, warm clothing, insulated boots, a hunting rifle with a scope. And the next morning before dawn, the three Garvey men set out into the wilderness to the north of their family home. They spent most of the day trekking along the banks of a winding river, following game trails, looking for signs of deer or elk. It was exhausting work for Robert, whose city lifestyle had not prepared him for hours of hiking through deep snow that came up to his knees, his breath fogging in the frigid air, his fingers numb despite the gloves, but it was also strangely peaceful. Meditative almost, just the sound of the wind in the pines, the crunch of snow under their boots, the occasional call of a raven or the distant crack of ice on the river, and as evening approached and the sun began to set, which happens early in Canadian winters with the light dying by 4 p.m., they decided to make camp near the river's edge. They had brought basic supplies, tents, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, food, a portable stove, and within an hour they had a decent camp set up with a small fire crackling in a stone ring, and they spent the evening eating dinner and swapping stories around the flames, roasted sausages and beans from a can, hot coffee from a thermos. And for Robert, it felt like coming home, like reconnecting with a part of himself he had forgotten existed. The city had its charm, sure, but there was something about being out here under the stars surrounded by wilderness that touched something deep in his soul, something primal and essential. They had been in their tents for several hours. The fire burned down to embers, the temperature plummeting to 20 below, when Robert felt nature calling. He had drunk too much coffee earlier, and now his bladder was insistently reminding him of that fact, and with a sigh he unzipped his sleeping bag and crawled out of his tent into the biting cold. The night was pitch black, no moon. No artificial light for miles in any direction, just stars above, brilliant and clear, in a way they never were in the city, and Robert used his flashlight to navigate the short distance from the tent to the river's edge, where he began to relieve himself, the steam rising from the snow where his urine hit, and that is when he noticed the smell. It hit him suddenly. A putrid odor that made his stomach turn. It smelled like rotting meat, like something dead that had been left in the sun too long, except there was no sun out here, just cold that should have preserved anything that died. Should have kept odors from spreading, and concerned, Robert finished his business quickly and pulled out his flashlight, shining it in the direction the smell seemed to be coming from. There were bushes a few feet away. Thick undergrowth that could hide, well, anything really, and the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the bushes, and his brother James stepped out into the light. Robert's initial spike of fear instantly turned to relief. "Jesus, James, you scared the hell out of me. Did you smell that? I think something died out here," but James didn't respond. He just stood there, maybe 10 feet away, smiling at Robert. Not a normal smile either. It was tight, forced, like someone who had never smiled before and was trying to figure out how, and he was holding out his hand toward Robert, palm up, fingers slightly curled, an odd gesture, an invitation, a request for help, and Robert said uncertainly, "James, you okay, man?" But still no response, just that strange, tight smile. And something about his brother's eyes was wrong. They were staring at Robert with an intensity that was deeply uncomfortable. like James was looking at him but not seeing him, like he was looking through him at something else. And the seconds ticked by, 5 seconds, 10, James didn't move, didn't blink, didn't say anything. Just stood there with that horrible smile and that outstretched hand. And then Robert noticed something else. His brother's clothes looked loose. Like they were too big for him suddenly. The hunting jacket that had fit James perfectly this morning now seemed to be sagging, hanging off his frame as if he had lost 50 pounds in a day, and Robert's rational mind tried to explain it. Maybe James had lost weight, but that was ridiculous. You don't lose enough weight to noticeably affect your clothing in a single day. Maybe the clothes got stretched somehow, but that didn't make sense either. And then he looked at James's face again and his blood turned cold. His brother's skin was sagging, actually sagging like a rubber mask that wasn't glued on properly, like it didn't quite fit the bones underneath. Robert could see wrinkles and folds appearing where none had been before, could see his brother's features beginning to distort, to shift, to change, and for a moment Robert's mind simply couldn't process what he was seeing. He was too far outside the realm of possibility, too far beyond anything his experience or education had prepared him for. The clothes continued to sag, and then as Robert watched in absolute horror, they began to slide off his brother's body. Not like someone taking off their clothes, like the clothes were falling through something, like there was nothing inside them to hold them up, and the skin, oh God, the skin, it was coming off too, peeling away, sloughing off like a snake shedding its skin, like a costume being removed, and underneath was something else. The thing that had been wearing his brother like a suit now stood revealed in the light of Robert's flashlight. It was tall. Much taller than James had been, at least 8 feet, maybe more, its body emaciated, skeletal, with pale gray skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Where its face should be, there was an elongated snout almost like a wolf or a dog, but wrong. So wrong, and where its eyes should be, there were 2 dark hollows. 2 empty voids that nonetheless seemed to be looking directly at Robert with malevolent intelligence. The clothes that had been James's lay in a heap on the ground as if the creature had simply stepped out of them, or perhaps they had passed through it as it dropped its disguise. And for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, Robert stood frozen. His body wouldn't respond to his brain's screaming commands to run, to do something, anything. He could only stare at this impossible thing. This nightmare made flesh, and the creature took a step toward him. That broke the spell. Robert screamed and turned to run, but he had barely taken 2 steps when he felt something grab his left leg with tremendous force. The next thing he knew, he was on the ground being dragged backward toward the creature. Panic gave him strength. He kicked wildly with his free leg, felt his boot connect with something solid. He rolled onto his back, scrabbling at the ground, trying to find anything he could use as a weapon. The creature loomed over him, those dark, hollow eyes staring down that snout-like mouth beginning to open to reveal teeth. Too many teeth. All of them sharp. And then there was a thunderous crack that echoed through the night. The grip on Robert's leg vanished. The creature recoiled, taking a step back. Robert looked frantically toward the sound and saw his father standing near the tense rifle, raised smoke curling from the barrel. His father fired again, and the creature turned and fled, moving with impossible speed despite its size disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of any light. Robert's father ran over and grabbed him, hauling him to his feet. "Are you hurt? Did it bite you? Did it?" And Robert gasped. "I'm okay," though he didn't feel okay. He felt like he might vomit or pass out or both. What was that? What the hell was that? And by now James had emerged from his tent with a rifle in hand, clearly just woken up by the commotion. What happened? "I heard shots." And Robert tried to explain. Tried to describe what he had seen, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. His brother had been there, except it hadn't been his brother. It had been something wearing his brother like a costume, and it had tried to grab him. And his father said, quietly examining Robert's leg with his flashlight, "James was in his tent the whole time. Whatever you saw, it wasn't your brother." And the light revealed deep scratches through Robert's pants, 4 parallel gouges that had broken the skin and were now bleeding freely. Whatever had grabbed him had claws, sharp ones, and without discussion, the 3 men immediately began breaking down their camp. Nobody suggested staying. Nobody suggested trying to track the creature or waiting until morning. They just packed up their gear as quickly as possible and started the long hike back home through the dark with weapons ready. James tried a few times to joke about it. to suggest that maybe Robert had seen a bear or misidentified something in the dark, but their father shut him down. I saw it too. Just for a second in the firelight, that wasn't a bear. That wasn't any animal I've ever seen, and they hiked through the night, not stopping until they reached their family's property as dawn was breaking. None of them slept that day. They just sat in the house, doors and windows locked, trying to make sense of what had happened. Robert's leg healed, though the scars remained. 4 parallel lines that he can still see today. He never went hunting in those woods again. In fact, he has never gone hunting anywhere again, because he knows now that the forests are not just home to deer and elk and other normal prey animals. They are home to other things too. Things that can wear the faces of people you know, can mimic their appearance perfectly, can use that disguise to get close enough to strike. Things that perhaps see humans the way humans see deer, just another food source. So now we have 3 accounts from 3 different time periods, from 3 different locations spanning thousands of miles: Tennessee, Texas, Canada, and yet the descriptions are remarkably consistent. A tall, emaciated figure with pale skin stretched over skeletal bones, glowing eyes that shine with an unnatural light, supernatural abilities including voice mimicry, shape-shifting, incredible speed and strength, and always that sense of overwhelming dread that survivors describe, that feeling that you are in the presence of something fundamentally wrong, something that shouldn't exist. These aren't the only modern accounts either. If you dig into online forums, if you talk to people in rural communities, if you listen to the stories that hunters and trappers tell when they think nobody's judging them, you will find hundreds of similar encounters, maybe thousands. The native tribes of North America have never had any doubt about the Wendigo's existence. To them, this isn't folklore or legend. It is fact. It is as real as bears or wolves, just more dangerous, more malevolent. But what exactly is a Wendigo? The traditional legends are divided on this point. Some tribes describe Wendigos as purely physical creatures, actual animals, albeit ones with mystical abilities. In these accounts, they are flesh and blood beings that can be killed, though conventional weapons may not work. They hunt and eat like any predator, but they prefer human prey above all others. Other tribes describe Wendigos as spiritual entities, demons or evil spirits that feed on negative energy and corruption. In these versions, the Wendigo is less a physical creature and more a force of nature, a manifestation of humanity's darkest impulses made manifest. And some traditions split the difference, describing a transformation process. A human who commits the taboo of cannibalism, whether by choice or necessity, gradually transforms into a Wendigo, their body changing, their humanity slipping away until nothing remains but an eternal, insatiable hunger. So which version is correct? Based on the modern accounts, it seems like the answer might be all of them. Bradley and Jacob's encounter seems to describe a physical creature with supernatural abilities. It could mimic voices, it was incredibly strong, strong enough to topple a full-size tree, and it moved through the forest with unnatural stealth despite its size, but it was solid, real, occupying physical space. Adam and Luke's experience suggests something similar, a physical being but one with impossible capabilities. Climbing 15 feet up a tree like it was nothing, moving faster than seemed possible, shrugging off bullets that should have stopped any normal animal. Robert's encounter, though, suggests something different, something that can shapeshift, that can take on the appearance of another person so perfectly that even a family member could be fooled. That is not just a physical creature, that is something with abilities that defy any known biological explanation. So perhaps the truth is that Wendigo is more of a category than a specific entity. Perhaps there are multiple types of these things, all related, all dangerous, but each with slightly different abilities and characteristics. Or perhaps, and this is the truly frightening possibility, they are all the same thing, capable of all these abilities. Physical when they need to be, spiritual when that serves them better, shapeshifters, voice mimics, nearly invulnerable to human weapons. Skeptics, of course, have their own explanations. They point to known psychological phenomena like mass hysteria, folie à deux, or Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome where people become convinced they are transforming into a Wendigo. They suggest that Wendigo sightings are just misidentifications of known animals, usually bears. A bear standing on its hind legs can reach 8 feet tall, has forward-facing eyes that can reflect light, and can be terrifying to encounter in the dark. They point out that many Wendigo encounters involve hunters who might have consumed wild mushrooms or plants with psychoactive properties. Hallucinations could explain the impossible abilities and the supernatural aspects, and for isolated incidents these explanations might make sense, but they don't explain the consistency of the reports across time and space. They don't explain encounters involving multiple witnesses who all describe the same thing. They don't explain physical evidence like the scratches on Robert's leg or the destroyed vegetation at multiple encounter sites. Most importantly, they don't explain why experienced outdoorsmen, people who have spent years in the wilderness, who know the local wildlife intimately, who are familiar with bears and other predators, are so absolutely certain that what they encountered was something else entirely. Bradley Clark is a former Marine. He is trained to maintain composure under pressure, to identify threats accurately, to operate effectively in hostile environments. And he was so terrified by what he encountered that he and his friend fled without even attempting to fight back. Adam Reed is a police officer with 15 years of experience. He has faced armed criminals. He has been in shootouts. He has seen the worst that humanity has to offer, and this creature made him empty his magazine and reload, firing at shadows gripped by a fear he had never experienced before. These are not people prone to panic or misidentification. These are trained professionals, men accustomed to danger and violence, and they were all convinced, absolutely convinced, that they had encountered something beyond normal experience. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these modern accounts is geographic. The Wendigo, according to traditional legends, is supposed to be confined to the far northern forests of the United States and Canada. It is a creature of the cold, of the deep wilderness, of places where humans rarely venture. But Bradley's encounter was in Alabama. That is hundreds of miles south of where Wendigos are supposed to be. The climate is completely different, hot, humid, temperate, rather than subarctic. Adam's encounter was in Texas, even further south and west. Rural Texas, yes, but still. Texas not exactly Wendigo territory according to the legends. Even Robert's encounter while in Canada was relatively close to civilization. They were just a few hours' hike from his family's home in woods that local hunters used regularly. So what is happening? Why are these creatures appearing in places they shouldn't be? There are a few possible explanations. The first is that Wendigos were never actually confined to the northern territories. That was just where most of the documented encounters occurred, because that is where the native tribes who spoke about them lived. Perhaps these entities have always had a much wider range than we realized living throughout North America's forests, and we are only now starting to pay attention to the reports. The second possibility is range expansion. As human development encroaches on wilderness areas, as logging and resource extraction pushes deeper into remote forests, as climate change alters ecosystems, perhaps Wendigos are being forced to move. Maybe they are fleeing their traditional territories and searching for new hunting grounds. The third, and perhaps most disturbing possibility is population growth. What if Wendigos reproduce? What if their numbers are increasing, spreading out from their original territories in search of prey? If the transformation legends are true, if humans can become Wendigos through cannibalism or other means, then every new Wendigo potentially creates an expanding wave of these creatures. And there is a fourth possibility that nobody wants to consider. What if they are following us? What if as human populations spread and grow, Wendigos are actively tracking that expansion, following us because we are their preferred prey? Think about the implications of that for a moment. These entities, whatever they are, might not be randomly distributed. They might be deliberately positioning themselves near human communities, near our towns and cities, near our homes. That would explain the increasing reports near suburban areas. It would explain sightings from state parks and recreational areas, places where humans regularly venture but that still have enough wilderness to provide cover for a predator. It would mean that the woods at the edge of your town, the forest preserve where you like to hike, the campground where you take your family, all of these places could potentially harbor something that sees humans as food. Here is a statistic that should concern everyone. According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, approximately 600,000 people are reported missing in the United States every year. Now, the vast majority of those cases get resolved quickly. Most missing persons are found within 48 hours. They were at a friend's house. There was a miscommunication. They simply left without telling anyone. Of those 600,000 annual reports, only about 90,000 remain active as open cases at any given time. But here's the disturbing part. A disproportionate number of those unsolved missing persons cases occur in rural areas, particularly in regions with extensive forests, and within that subset there is a pattern of cases that share disturbing similarities. People vanishing without trace despite extensive search efforts, disappearances that occur when the person was only briefly alone or separated from their group, cases where search and rescue teams find no evidence, no clothing, no equipment, nothing despite covering the area where the person was last seen. Are all of these cases Wendigo attacks? Of course not. People go missing for lots of reasons: accidents, getting lost, suicide, foul play by other humans, animal attacks by known predators. But some of these cases have details that, once you know about Wendigo encounters, start to seem eerily relevant. Cases where the missing person's friends or family reported hearing their voice, calling for help, leading searchers into difficult terrain where no trace was found. Cases where experienced hikers, hunters, or outdoorsmen vanished in areas they knew well, as if something lured them off their familiar paths. Cases where the last known contact was the person saying they had heard or seen something strange, something they were going to investigate. Consider the cluster of disappearances in the national parks. There has been significant research and documentation of these cases. Hundreds of people who have vanished in national parks and forests under mysterious circumstances. Some of these disappearances have explanations, but many don't, and some of them have details that match what we know about Wendigo behavior: voice mimicry. People being lured away from safety by sounds that seemed familiar. Experienced outdoorsmen making uncharacteristic mistakes or going into dangerous areas for no apparent reason. David Paulides, a former law enforcement officer, has documented hundreds of these cases in his Missing 411 series. While he doesn't explicitly attribute them to Wendigos or any other cryptid, the patterns he has identified are disturbing. People disappearing from areas that were subsequently searched exhaustively with no trace found. Missing persons later discovered in locations that had already been thoroughly searched as if they had been placed there afterward. Cases involving experienced outdoorsmen who should have known better making fatal decisions. Could Wendigos be responsible for at least some of these disappearances? It is impossible to say definitively, but if we accept that these creatures exist, if we take the eyewitness accounts seriously, then we have to acknowledge the possibility. A creature that can mimic voices could lure people away from safety. A creature with supernatural speed and strength could abduct someone without leaving evidence. A creature that may have spiritual or supernatural aspects could potentially move through areas without leaving tracks or other physical signs. And if Wendigos are expanding their range as the modern sightings suggest, then the number of potential encounters and potential victims is increasing. This brings us to perhaps the most important question. If you encounter a Wendigo, what do you do? Can these things be fought? Can they be killed? The traditional legends offer conflicting advice. Some tribes say that Wendigos can only be killed by fire, that their bodies must be completely burned to prevent them from regenerating or returning. Other traditions say that silver weapons are effective, similar to werewolf legends. Some stories claim that only shamans or medicine men with specific knowledge and spiritual power can combat a Wendigo successfully. The modern accounts suggest that conventional firearms may not be effective. Remember Adam Reed, an experienced police officer and excellent marksman, fired multiple shots at close range with no apparent effect? Jacob specifically warned Bradley that bullets were useless based on stories he had heard from local hunters. But Robert Garvey's father did drive the creature off with rifle fire, so maybe firearms can harm them, even if they don't kill them. Maybe the goal isn't to kill a Wendigo, but simply to create enough pain or damage to make it decide you are not worth the effort. The consistency of one particular survival strategy across all three accounts is striking. When confronted with a Wendigo, the survivors ran. They didn't stand and fight. They didn't try to wound the creature and then track it. They just fled to safety as quickly as possible. And that might be the most important lesson we can take from these encounters. If you find yourself in a situation where you believe you have encountered a Wendigo or something similar, don't investigate the strange sounds or voices. That is what it wants you to do. It is trying to lure you away from safety, away from help, into a position where you are vulnerable. Don't try to fight it unless you have absolutely no other choice. These things are stronger, faster, and more durable than any human. They operate by rules we don't understand. Your best weapons may be useless against them. Run toward safety, toward lights, toward other people. Get back to civilization as quickly as possible. And once you are safe, stay safe. Don't go back. Don't try to prove what you saw. Don't attempt revenge or justice. Just survive. If you are with others, stay together. Every one of these accounts involved multiple people, and in each case, having others present was crucial to survival. The creatures seemed to prefer isolated victims. Trust your instincts. All 3 survivors reported feeling that something was wrong before they actually saw the creature. They felt fear, unease, a sense of danger. If you are in the woods and you suddenly feel like you need to leave, like something is watching you, like you are in danger, don't dismiss that feeling, act on it immediately, and perhaps most importantly, tell people where you are going. When you are heading into remote areas, make sure someone knows your plans, your route, and when you are expected back, if you encounter something and don't make it out, at least searchers will know where to look. So where does that leave us? We have centuries of consistent legends from indigenous peoples who have no reason to fabricate these stories. We have modern eyewitness accounts from credible sources describing encounters that match those ancient legends remarkably well. We have physical evidence, scratches, tracks, destroyed vegetation. We have multiple witnesses in multiple locations separated by time and space, who nonetheless report seem essentially the same thing. Can all of this be explained away as misidentification, hallucination, and folklore? Possibly. The rational, skeptical part of our minds wants to find conventional explanations. We don't want to believe that there are monsters in the woods, entities that see us as prey, things that can't be killed with our modern weapons. But the evidence is troubling and it is mounting. More sightings are being reported each year. More people are coming forward with their encounters. More strange disappearances occur in our forests and rural areas that we can't adequately explain. Whether you call it a Wendigo, a demon, a cryptid, or simply an unknown species, there seems to be something in the North American wilderness that doesn't fit our understanding of the natural world. Something dangerous, something that may be spreading. The forests are vast. The wilderness areas of the United States and Canada cover millions of square miles. Much of this territory is rarely visited by humans, rarely patrolled, rarely monitored. It is entirely possible that large, dangerous creatures could exist in these areas without being definitively documented by science, and if they do exist, if they are real, then we need to ask ourselves some very serious questions. How many of them are there? Where exactly are they located? Are their numbers growing? What triggers them to attack? Can they be avoided, or are encounters simply a matter of bad luck? Most importantly, are we safe? If you live in or near rural areas, if you spend time hiking or hunting in forests, if you camp or explore wilderness regions, you need to be aware that there might be more than just bears and mountain lions out there. There might be something else, something older, something hungrier, something that our ancestors warned us about but that we chose to forget. I don't have answers to these questions, nobody does not definitively, but I do know this: Bradley Clark, Adam Reed, and Robert Garvey are not lying. They are not confused. They are not misremembering or exaggerating. They know what they saw, and what they saw changed them. Bradley rarely goes into the woods anymore, even in broad daylight. Adam carries high-powered rifle rounds in his vehicle at all times. Robert never returned to Canada after that trip and refuses to discuss what happened with anyone outside his immediate family. These are the reactions of men who encountered something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. Something that made them afraid in a way they had never been afraid before. And the truly terrifying part, they were lucky. They survived. They got away. How many of those didn't? How many of those missing persons cases? Those unexplained disappearances, those hunters who never came home, how many of them encountered the same thing but didn't escape? We may never know. But the next time you are in the woods and you hear a voice calling for help, and something deep in your gut tells you that something is wrong, remember these stories. Remember that in the deepest parts of our forests, where the trees grow thick and the sunlight barely penetrates, where human civilization feels like a distant memory, there might still be things that hunt us. Things with glowing eyes and impossible abilities. Things that were old when our ancestors first set foot on this continent. Things that have never stopped being hungry. The Wendigo is out there, and it is waiting, so stay safe, friends. Stay vigilant. And if you see something in the woods that doesn't make sense, something that fills you with inexplicable dread, don't investigate. Just run.